April 3rd, 2025. Trump's announcement last night that he was placing high tariffs on countries around the world came after the stock market closed, but it drove stock futures dramatically downward. Overseas, global markets also plunged. Today, before the stock market opened, Trump posted on his social media site, "The operation is over. The patient lived and is healing. The prognosis is that the patient will be far stronger, bigger, better, and more resilient than ever before. Make America great again." Fittingly, it was former Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani who rang the bell opening the stock market today. Giuliani represented Newsmax, the right-wing media channel with ties to Trump. As soon as the market opened, stocks fell straight down. By the end of the day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had dropped 1,679 points, falling about 4%, its biggest fall since the coronavirus pandemic took hold in 2020. The S&P 500 fell 274 points, or 4.8%. The NASDAQ Composite fell more than 1,050 points, or almost 6%. The losses wiped out about $2 trillion. Trump justified the tariffs by declaring that the U.S. is in the midst of a national emergency. But this afternoon, he left the White House for a long weekend in Florida, where his private Doral resort outside of Miami is holding the first domestic golf tournament of the season of Live Golf, which is financed by the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Saudi Arabia. Trump's tariffs are not an economic policy. Tariffs are generally imposed on products, not on nations. By placing them on countries, the White House was able to arrive at its numbers with a nonsensical formula that appears to have been reached by asking AI how to impose tariffs, a suggestion I dismissed as outlandish when I saw it last night, but that economist Paul Krugman today identified as a likely possibility. CNBC's Steve Leisman said, "Nobody ever heard of this formula. Nobody has ever used this formula. So I'm sorry, but the conclusion seems to be the president kind of made this up as he went along." Today, former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers posted, "It is now clear that the Trump administration computed reciprocal tariffs without using tariff data. This is to economics what creationism is to biology, astrology is to astronomy, or RFK thought is to vaccine science. The Trump tariff policy makes little sense even if you believe in protectionist, mercantilist economics." Editor of the American Prospect, David Dayen, notes that there is no apparent policy behind the tariffs. No thought, for example, as to whether it is even possible for the U.S. to ramp up the kind of domestic manufacturing Trump claims to want. While Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told CBS, "You're going to see employment leaping starting today," in fact, both automaker Stellantis and appliance manufacturer Whirlpool announced layoffs because of the tariffs. Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo points out that building and establishing a new plant in the U.S. will take a minimum of 3 to 5 years, even if investors are inclined to support one. But Victoria Guida reported in Politico that corporate executives are saying they cannot invest in manufacturing until they can project costs, and Trump is far too unpredictable to enable them to do that with any confidence. Dayen writes that Trump's tariffs are essentially sanctions on the rest of the world. His behavior is, Dayen says, no different from a mob boss moving into town and sending his thugs to every business on Main Street, roughing up the proprietors and asking for protection money so they don't get pushed out of business. Dayen notes that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent argued last year for using the extraordinary power of the U.S. economy to force other countries to do as the U.S. wants, creating a U.S. sphere of influence through economic pressure. Extending the comparison to a mob boss, Dayen notes that protection money could take many forms: curbing migration, taking in more U.S. farm exports or weapons systems, reducing industrial capacity in China and forcing more consumption, buying long-dated U.S. debt on the cheap, siding with a war strategy against Iran, literally anything the White House wants. Trump's son Eric appeared to confirm that the tariffs are a shakedown when he posted, "I wouldn't want to be the last country that tries to negotiate a trade deal with Trump. The first to negotiate will win, the last will absolutely lose. I have seen this movie my entire life." Foreign affairs journalist David Rothkopf was more graphic. "These aren't tariffs," he wrote. "They are a horse's head in the bed of almost every world government and business leader." Hedge fund manager Bill Ackman suggested that if a government refused to negotiate with Trump, that country's major companies should deal directly with Trump, exempting that company's products from tariffs in exchange for a new factory or some other investment Trump wants. Trump is overturning the past 80 years of global trade cooperation in order to concentrate power in his own hands. Congress began to take down the tariff walls of the late 19th and early 20th centuries when it passed the 1934 Reciprocal Tariff Act, enabling the president to lower the high tariff rates Republicans had established with the 1930 Smoot Hawley tariff. That tariff had worsened the Great Depression. With the turn away from tariff walls, global trade has fostered international cooperation and created the rising prosperity of the 20th century. The global economy is fundamentally different today than it was yesterday, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney said today. The system of global trade anchored on the United States is over. Our old relationship of steadily deepening integration with the United States is over. The 80-year period when the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, when it forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect, and championed the free and open exchange of goods and services, is over. While this is a tragedy, it is also the new reality. Ending systems of global free trade dovetails with the idea of getting rid of the international rules-based order created after World War II. After that horrific war, world leaders decided to create a system of international institutions, like the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, to provide ways in which countries could protect their sovereignty and work out their differences without going to war. Trump's threats against other countries, including Greenland, an autonomous territory of NATO ally Denmark, are a direct rejection of those principles. That rejection reinforces the Trump regime's embrace of Vladimir Putin's Russia, which invaded Ukraine first in 2014 and again in 2022, and is trying to justify grabbing Ukrainian territory. Under Trump, the U.S. is siding with Russia rather than Ukraine in this war, in a stunning rejection of the institutions and principles that have stabilized the globe since World War II. Putin is now threatening NATO countries, prompting them to prepare for defense. "We are not at war," NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said recently, "but we are certainly not at peace either." Some of those advocating tariff walls and forcing our allies to maintain their own defense suggest that creating a U.S. sphere of influence is the best way to counter a rising China. But there is no doubt that the concept of such spheres caters to the worldview of Russian and Chinese leaders. As scholar of authoritarianism Timothy Snyder points out, weakening the U.S. and its allies also benefits Russia by increasing Russia's power relative to other countries, making it easier to establish the multipolar world Russia wants. The Trump administration is also undermining post-World War II democracy at home. Last night, Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat of Connecticut, identified Trump's tariffs as a tool to collapse our democracy, a means to compel loyalty from every business that will need to petition Trump for relief. Murphy pointed to Trump's shakedown of prominent law firms, 4 of which he has attacked with executive orders. He also pointed to Trump's attacks on universities, withholding government funding until their administrators bow to MAGA's ideological demands. Sarah D. Wire of USA Today reported that earlier this week, the Institute for Museum and Library Studies was effectively closed, and over the past 2 days, the administration told libraries across the country that grants awarded last year have been terminated. Today, the administration cut federal grants for arts and humanities across the country. Museums, archives, historic sites, educational projects, and so on, all defunded. It also cut this year's funding for National History Day, a popular history program in schools that is already underway. On Tuesday, the Department of Health and Human Services slashed jobs and programs in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, even as measles continues to spread and 2 Louisiana infants have died of whooping cough. Today, news broke that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, is implementing a hiring freeze, even as flash floods and tornadoes just today have killed at least 7 people in the Midwest to the Mid-South. The plan, as Vice President J.D. Vance explained in a 2021 interview, is to destroy the current government, business, educational, cultural, and scientific pillars of the United States in order to replace them with a new system. Although there is tension between the Project 2025 wing of MAGA and the technocrats wing over whether that new system will be a theocracy or a technocracy. In either case, it will be an authoritarian government in which power and money concentrate in a very few hands. The administration's crusade against the state of Maine shows what this looks like. After Maine Governor Janet Mills told Trump the state would follow state and federal law rather than bow to his demands, acting Social Security Administration Commissioner Leland Dudek canceled contracts permitting Maine parents to apply for Social Security numbers for their newborns from the hospital, and for Maine families to report deaths from funeral homes. Told such a change would risk identity theft and wasteful spending, Dudek told the agency to do it anyway in order to punish Mills. After an outcry, Dudek backtracked, but yesterday the Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, announced she was freezing federal funds for Maine educational programs. The Trump administration would stand against a leftist social agenda, Rollins wrote. The problem for Republicans is that while the sort of inflammatory language Rollins used has been a staple of the party for decades, the MAGA agenda itself is not popular. Only about 4% of voters who knew about Project 2025 wanted to see it enacted. And billionaire Elon Musk, who runs the Department of Government Efficiency that is slashing through government programs, is so unpopular that his support for a candidate in Tuesday's Wisconsin Supreme Court election actually appeared to have hurt rather than helped that candidate. Now party members have to deal with the fact their president has tanked the economy by enacting what the National Review says is likely the largest peacetime tax hike in U.S. history. Now, countries around the globe are imposing reciprocal tariffs on the U.S., while also negotiating their own trade agreements that cut out the U.S. Those agreements are not only for products like soybeans, but also for weapons, a development the administration is protesting. Republican members of Congress could stop Trump at any time. In the case of tariffs, they could simply reassert their constitutional power to manage tariffs. If they choose not to, and the economy doesn't recover and thrive as Trump keeps promising, voters can be expected to hold them, as well as him, to account. Right now, Republican leaders appear to be hoping that Trump's attempt to extort other countries will work and the tariffs will be short-lived. But their enthusiasm for that strategy seems to be well under control. Today, Bill Ackman resorted to defending the tariffs by posting, "Sometimes the best strategy in a negotiation is convincing the other side you are crazy."
Letters from an American was written and read by Heather Cox Richardson. It was produced at Soundscape Productions, Dedham, Massachusetts. Recorded with music composed by Michael Moss.